I'm Marvin Smith, your host of Funding Bravely, a podcast about courage and philanthropy, what it looks like, why it matters, and how we grow it. For nearly 20 years, I've worked at the intersection of philanthropy, policy, and storytelling, building bridges between donors, communities, and ideas that change systems. I helped launch an education, research, and development fund that's mobilized $200 million in philanthropic commitments to big opportunity areas in K-12 education. And I've led coalitions that have secured federal investments to expand opportunity for students nationwide. Funding Bravely surfaces the unseen courage of leaders challenging power, moving money faster, and reshaping what more bold pathways to impact can look like in partnership with communities. The goal isn't just to admire courage, it's to spread it and to inspire every listener to fund more bravely. I'm so excited to welcome Dimple Abichandani to Funding Bravely today. Dimple is a nationally recognized philanthropic leader, writer, and lawyer, and an author of a wonderful book, A New Era of Philanthropy, 10 Practices to Transform Wealth into a More Just Future, that offers fresh answers to the question of how philanthropy can meet this moment. For 2 decades, she's worked to reshape philanthropy's purpose and practice while leading innovative funding institutions, most recently as executive director of the General Service Foundation, where she aligned the foundation's grant-making, investments, and governance with justice values. Dimple, welcome to Funding Bravely. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Marvin. I'm so excited to be with you.
Well, Dimple, I want to jump right in and invite you to share about what courage means to you personally. Share with us, what's one of your earliest experiences with courage? And how does it still show up for you in your work or your leadership today?
Hmm. Um, yeah. It's such a relevant question for our times. And you asking it inspired me to remember an experience I had as a college student. I went to school at the University of Texas at Austin. I was there in the 90s. And I was there in this moment when the kind of conservatives were experimenting with supporting a lot of campus organizing. So in my time at the University of Texas, we really saw the growth of this organization called Young Conservatives of Texas. And they sort of changed everything on campus. But I was remembering in particular this one thing that happened where they started organizing against our health services department that had programming for LGBTQ students, and claiming that it was a misuse of our student fees to provide those services. And it was a lively campus, a very progressive campus, and so a lot of us would go out and we were protesting that move. And they issued, I think it was in our campus paper, they issued the statement that at the next protest, they were going to show up with cameras and take photos of whoever showed up and send letters to their parents saying, you think that your student is here on campus studying, but really they're out here standing up for, and this is their language, but like deviant lifestyles or something like that. And it was a moment that I think taught me that often to really stand for something, so to have courage, one must be willing to risk something, right? So
We come back to that notion of risk throughout this.
Yeah. But that, and it also, it's funny, I remember that, and then I think about all the tactics that we're seeing in this moment, the punishing of people who are telling history, the punishing of people for using certain language. And I think back to that experience that I had on campus, and I think what it taught me was that it taught me to be very aware to the red flags of of people gaining power through silencing of the truth. Like, so it's something that I think gave me an opportunity at an early age to um, learn to tell the truth.
Mm.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that story personally, and easy to see some of what you and your fellow classmates had to experience on campus back then, still being in existence in the world that we're living in today, very personally, um, and absolutely within the world of philanthropy, and how philanthropy is facing a lot of these kinds of challenges as a sector, before we get inside of it and look at relationships between institutions and organizations, causes that they may be funding. I want to get just a little bit transition there for Dimple into some more of the origin story from this really lovely book you've written, which is part inspiration from me moving from idea of this podcast and some early momentum to getting it over the finish line. So I have to thank you for
Love
that.
that.
Well, I'm
I
here.
love that.
Yeah. You've written powerfully about this question: can philanthropy meet this moment? Um, when did that question first start to haunt you? If we kind of move
Yeah.
up from your time on campus at UT Austin to more recent times when you've been in this.
Yeah. So, my path, I'll just kind of back up and share a little bit about my work in philanthropy. Because, you know, I, the spaces that I've occupied in philanthropy have been um, spaces, organizations, roles where we've had a really clear commitment to justice. Um, and, so my introduction to philanthropy was through the Third Wave Fund, feminist organization started by young people, right? And we basically started it to fund ourselves because we felt like philanthropy didn't understand us. I, started and ran a collaborative fund, moving resources to Muslim, Arab, South Asian communities in the post 9/11 period. Um, Again, marginal communities that were being marginalized by mainstream philanthropy, and we were able to do some really important things there. And then most recently, I ran a private foundation that was very intentionally focused on racial justice, gender justice, economic justice. So I offer that background to say that when I left my most recent role, where I had had so much space to innovate and to, do many of the things that, were later kind of titled trust-based practices. I had the chance to really think differently and build new ways of being. When I left that role and I started to think about moving into another similar role at a larger institution, I was surprised to find that I kept hearing this question in my mind of, but do I believe that philanthropy can meet this moment?
Mm.
So I was, 2022, I was crystal clear that we, are alive in a very consequential time. So my orientation was I want to basically be working wherever I can make the biggest impact. And so this question about, but do I believe philanthropy can meet the moment really surprised me. And, I realized pretty quickly that at first I was like, is that burnout? Where is that coming from?
Mm.
Um, and I think it was in part coming from the fact that, we, by the middle of 2022, I could see kind of that the tide was turning and that some of the progress that the sector had made towards understanding and funding, structural issues like funding racial justice, um, you know, moving towards ways of funding that didn't just center the donor, that there was this whole like return to normal conversation that was beginning. And it was quiet at the time, but we can, from 2025, we can look back and see that it got louder. So I think some of it was just that the changes that we saw in the sector in 2020 and, until 2022 of moving towards ways of funding that aligned more with what communities needed, more participatory grant making, increased payouts, and most importantly, really the understanding that we can have of stance towards funding that's about repair, right? That our sector has committed incredible harm. The ethos that I was starting to see was one of return to normal.
Mm.
And it left me with this deep question of, can philanthropy actually, can we make durable change? And also, yeah, so I started to ask that question. I realized other people were having the question. And then I actually kind of tweaked the question to be the question at the heart of the book, which is not like, can philanthropy meet the moment, but what is a philanthropy that meets the moment?
Mm-hmm.
Or put another way, what's a philanthropy for our times?
Mm.
That was because I just felt like sitting in the place of, can we, can't we, it wasn't generative. So I wanted to kind of ask a question that was more generative, and where I wanted to look for those answers actually initially was by really looking at and lifting up the leadership that we sort of, the once in a lifetime leadership that we have had, of a whole generation of leaders of color who had come into the sector. And we're doing things very differently. And I think I write about this in the book, that I think our, to generalize, I think our conception and our starting point and our reason for being in these roles had to do with the communities that we were coming from, and our sort of accountability and love of community, not kind of, like previous generations, not sort of leadership by virtue of proximity to resources or to the wealth, or a stance of protecting donors. So to me, it struck me that there was something fundamentally different about how we were practicing our philanthropy. And I wanted to dig deeper into that. I wanted to document it. I wanted to learn from it. And then the kind of surprise of writing this book was that where I found my answer about how we build a philanthropy for our times was actually by looking at the past, the far past, and understanding how we got to this moment.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the gift of the writing research process.
Yeah, that was one of so many gifts I've found in reading this book, understanding the history of this sector, and the origins being about wealth preservation, advancement, protection, much more than redistribution. And love to hear that, for you, the call is less about a binary, can philanthropy meet this moment or not, but what must it look like? What can we do to transform it, into a new image that's doing right by the communities that we're seeking to work with and have an impact with them?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, going back and reading the Gospel of Wealth, which is one of our origin documents, right? That really kind of was, it sets out this idea of philanthropy. Going back and kind of revisiting that text, which is 140 years old, and realizing that the ideas contained in it live in our institutions today. They live in our practices, they live in our norms, they live in our culture. right? So, part of what I share in the book, and I do it through kind of a creative format. I do it through, I imagine, a podcast conversation, similar to we're having a podcast. Podcasts are the medium of our time. So I imagine a podcast where I invite Andrew Carnegie to join me on the podcast, and together we're talking about philanthropy and philanthropy's role. And every quote in there from Andrew is straight from the Gospel of Wealth. But we're having this dialogue across time where I'm telling him how it turned out 140 years later, So I think for me, the few things that really stood out from that text is the ways in which, in Andrew's lifetime when he was writing it, it was still a fairly new phenomena for a couple of people to own most of the resources and for everyone else to be struggling. Like in that moment when he was writing it, that was a newish economic order. And he was so aware of its limitations and its harms. I mean, he begins the Gospel of Wealth with just saying flat out, I know this new economic system is really hard for people. I know people are struggling. And then he goes on to say, but I've got a solution. We're going to do something. We're going to do philanthropy. And, he goes on then to kind of describe how we are going to make better choices and decisions with this money than you would have made had the money come to you in small sums. The small sums, of course, being wages. So this kind of idea that philanthropy can actually be a rationale for economic exploitation. He goes on to talk about this economic order as being a difficult one for most people, but not really up for debate because it's the quote law of civilization. So again, this kind of enshrining in our origin document, this kind of extreme capitalism that leaves most people out of economic justice. And then, to me, the most important thing is Carnegie, Andrew, I call him Andrew because we spent so much time together as I was writing this book. We kind of got on first name
Yeah,
basis.
demystify him. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, what a complex guy. And, I say complex because he himself was an immigrant. His parents were like working people who struggled. They fought for unions. Um, he started working when he was 12. It's like, um, and, when he was kind of at the height of his career and owned all these steel mills and the workers that at his steel mills were organizing, one of the things that he, was in his life most known for was that he called out these private police to go and squash the protests, the workers who were asking for a living wage, who were asking for um, reasonable working hours. And, you know, on his watch, at his factory, and at his direction, we had in his lifetime one of the deadliest um, labor disputes with 10 people dying. And it's it was what he was known for in his life. Like that, we know him as the patron saint of libraries. And I say this in the book that, we know him that way because he wanted to be remembered as a patron and as a saint. But in his lifetime, when he went, and there were cities that actually said, we don't want your money to build a library in our town because this is blood money. There's, we know what you did at that steel mill.
Even at that time.
even
There-
in his time. I mean, what's amazing is the achieving of, you know, I guess you would say legacy, but the achieving of a different story, right, through his philanthropy. So the thing I would say that, really stayed with me from reading all of, both about him and the Gospel of Wealth was this one thing where in the Gospel of Wealth, he's so clear about the purpose of philanthropy. And he says, the purpose is we're going to do a little bit of good, but we're not going to change the systems. And he even goes on to say it would be criminal for us to try to do that. And by systems, what he's referring to is, the systems that shape how power and wealth are held,
mm-hmm.
right? And so if you're not going to change those systems, then then philanthropy becomes a tool for preserving a status quo that oftentimes, and certainly in our lifetime, is filled with inequities, structural inequities, right?
Yeah. I want to pick the conversation up from there, Dimple, and you talking about the tools of the sector of philanthropy. If you imagine maybe some of Andrew's modern day colleagues and how they might be approaching this work of philanthropy with significant resources, seeking to make as much of an impact as they can, and with causes important to them, and taking advantage of some tools at their disposal. Where are they falling short, and how they understand their tools and how they can be used effectively or more effectively for the causes that they
Yeah.
support?
Well, what I offer in the book is, taking that history in. What I offer is that we can really understand kind of Andrew and the first 140 years of philanthropy that he put into motion as a gilded philanthropy. And that term gilded, it refers to covering something over with fake gold, right? So it's the Gilded Age. The idea was that things seem like they're kind of shiny and gold, but it's actually, there's all this kind of exploitation under the surface. And I say that his philanthropy is a gilded philanthropy because if we're not actually trying to solve systemic problems, but instead we're kind of using philanthropy just to cover them up, then those unjust systems persist. And the invitation, the call of the book is to understand that a philanthropy for our times is one that doesn't do that work of gilding anymore. And I actually think we can't. I mean, I think that between Andrew's time and our time, you've had philanthropy grow and you've had inequality grow, right? And so that in some ways tells us everything we need to know. So the challenge to us and the invitation, the opportunity is to actually use our capital, the $1.9 trillion that's sitting in endowments today, to use that capital to actually transform the systems that shape how power and wealth are held. And that's a very different purpose.
Yeah.
And that's why I call the book A New Era of Philanthropy, because what I kind of chart is, if you kind of look, we're about a decade into this era of polycrisis, where we're all kind of living through multiple interdependent crises at the same time. Democracy's under attack, climate in crisis, widening, deepening inequality. And the philanthropy that we've on the edges of the sector that we've been starting to forge, that tries to meet these challenges, it's fundamentally different, because each of these challenges at its core are about power, right? So a philanthropy that starts with kind of Andrew's point of, I'm a philanthropist and so I know best, and I'm going to use my power to just build the world in my image, that kind of philanthropy just feels really irrelevant today.
Yeah.
It's not part of the solution, right? I'll just keep naming philanthropies that feel irrelevant to me today. Um, one really common one that we see.
Service announcement here.
Yeah, I mean, a common one that we see in our times. Tech companies that are actively undermining our democracy, right? With their um, revenue generating tools. And then over here on the side, they set up a foundation, and the foundation is supposedly helping our democracy with get out the vote work.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very gilded philanthropy approach, right? Where you're actively using your philanthropy to cover over harm that you are doing, but not actually stopping the harm or not changing the systems. So we see a lot of that, but even, I mean, I would say a place we see this impulse towards preservation is in the norm around spending and the norms around investments. So the norm, even today, even in these times of so much crisis, the philanthropic norm and also the philanthropic legal minimum for spending is 5% of your assets annually. And the other 95%, most foundations invest that in the stock market or in other investments. But if you step back, what you can see is that the vast majority of assets, of capital, is invested in the status quo and keeping things exactly how they are. Right? And then you've got 5% going out the door that is supposedly supposed to bring about some change.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a
So
Herculean task right there.
it's hard. So what you're doing is you're preserving the power relationships. You're also just preserving the capital. Right? And so that's the other piece that, the way philanthropy has evolved is that these foundations have grown and grown and grown in asset size and with that in power. And meanwhile, the challenges in our communities continue to persist, right? And so these are kind of the ideas that, I offer in the book, just even in the title, 10 practices to transform wealth into a more just and sustainable future. It's a lot of words, but it was important to me to put that in the title because I don't think that we have consensus in the sector that our job is to transform the wealth. And that's one of the things I hope people take away from the book, that if you are not actively taking that wealth, that excess wealth, as Andrew would have called it, and doing a type of alchemy, which is really how I think about what good philanthropy is. Like, you take the capital and you mix it with relationships, you mix it with imagination, you mix it with community input and voice, right? And you're mixing it with trust. You're bringing all these other things to the capital. If you do that, you unleash a transformative potential at the capital, right? That you will not have if you're just investing it in the S&P index, right? That's not going to take you to transformation. And so even something as simple as moving our sector towards understanding it's our job to end up with less money and more widely held prosperity in our communities. Like, these are the ideas that I hope to share through the book, and that to me represent the new era.
I love that. Yeah, there's this notion out there that this wealth should exist in perpetuity. And when we're all chasing impact or purporting to be chasing impact, what greater impact than to disrupt the systems that are upholding the inequities and the progress that lots of these donors are wanting to see addressed, and moving more money and investing it in ways that are really aligned to the mission. So I thank you for that call. I want to shift for a minute. When you talk about changing systems, I want to just bring in this idea of risk. And, honestly, I feel like half the times it's been brought up throughout my career, it's unclear what exactly we're talking about. What kind of risk are we afraid of? What are we afraid of happening if we don't calculate this or mitigate it in some way? And therefore, it shows up as kind of this boogeyman. That really inhibits the kind of bold action that needs to take place in philanthropy. So I wonder if you could just share and how you think about risk. How does risk aversion impact courage in philanthropy from your experience?
I mean, so many philanthropic cultures are just at their core very risk averse, and I think it's in part like when I think about for a long time, the people who came into philanthropy or were recruited in often came from either legal culture, corporate culture, or banking cultures, right? Like they came from those three sectors. Um, and all three of those sectors kind of teach people, I think, um, to see risk as something to be avoided. Um, what's interesting to me is that this moment we're in right now, I think, is unique in that, I've worked in the sector for 2 decades and have experienced the kind of the slow movingness, the caution, and the what people call risk aversion. And oftentimes the way I've heard risk framed is in terms of um, the risk that a grantee won't do what we want them to do. Like it's about when people say risk, it's really about controlling outcomes. Oftentimes it's about reputational risk. Like if a grantee does something that is controversial or reflects poorly on the foundation. So you saw a lot of this, I think, in 2021. Foundations upset that, someone that they funded said defund somewhere. you know and so this kind of, oh well, that funding those types of organizations now is considered risky, right? um None of that has ever really resonated with me because I think the way that I have always thought about risk in philanthropy is um the risks of not doing enough, the risks of losing gains that we have supported.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So um, the the risks of not quite grasping the stakes in a particular time, and so you're just kind of moving around like business as usual, but actually the context has shifted, the rules have changed. Those are the kinds of risks that I have been, I would say, long paying attention to. I think, the reason I'm saying that this moment is a little bit different is that we are in a moment where, funders, some funders, a few funders have been attacked by the administration.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's broad concern that, the attacks could grow and that there could be more attacks. And so, you add to this already risk averse sector, um, you can add in this moment kind of fear of investigations, fear of um, being accused of having done something wrong, um, and that one is. Whereas I would say for most of my time in philanthropy, I have felt like people's assessment of risk has just been like I've just felt like, what are you talking about? This is not
Mm-hmm.
like that's not a risky grant. In this moment, I mean, I would say the kind of philanthropy that is needed right now,
Mm.
I think it is risky. That's my assessment. And I think we have to do it anyway.
Right. It's
So
been intended to be risk capital too, right?
it's intended to be risk capital. It is. You know, people throw that statement around a lot. And I've thought about that statement. And I think I just don't know if it really translates for me, because when people say that, it comes from like the VC context. It comes from like, people often talk about, right? Like the venture capital, we have a pot of risk capital. And
Mhm.
so at the end of it, the idea is supposed to be that you take a risk, you might lose, like, VC people. I'm in the Bay Area, so VC people always say this. We made 10 investments, we're fine if 9 go under. And they say that because the one that doesn't go under is just going to make them such obscene amounts of money, right? That it's okay. They're like willing to, like, the others failing is like the price of their success. I don't know how to kind of make sense of that in the context of philanthropy, because we're not supposed to be winning in philanthropy. Like, we're not supposed to be like having like good returns or getting something back. So that, at least that's how I feel. Like
Yeah.
it makes me very uncomfortable. When I was running a foundation, and I was running a foundation in the first Trump administration, stock market was on fire for years, right? And I would look at our stock return, like I would look at our, investment returns. We would have these years where I remember there was like a year where it was like 19% returns. That, like, nothing about that felt
Hmm.
right.
Hmm.
Because that's like, we're not, our purpose, like, to go back to purpose, right? Our purpose was not to take this particular pot of money and grow it, because this pot of money is earmarked for the public good,
Hmm.
right? So, yeah. So that's why I think that you're right. People say like philanthropic capital is supposed to be risk capital, but I think the broader metaphor, I get a little bit lost with it.
Yeah. Thank you for calling that out. I feel at some point there's been a huge shift over years to embrace this, VC way of working, the lingo. It might add some credibility in some circles. They're chasing this unicorn, and you talk often with folks who've um, adopted that way of thinking and working and expectations, and they're often not able to call out many organizations they've supported that have met these kinds of outcomes that these investors think they can manage and assure accomplishment of. So um yeah, a new invitation. The VC world is not and should not be philanthropy. We're getting closer to our time, Dimple. I wondered if you could take us back personally when you mentioned up front moving away from this question of can philanthropy meet this moment or not, and offering a set of practices you're encouraging the sector to embrace instead. What is giving you some amount of optimism personally, uh, and what we can do in this moment to write a different story?
Mm. So I'm sharing my book around the country, and one of the things I'm noticing is that for the first time in many, many years, I don't have to convince anybody of the stakes in this moment.
Mm.
And that's different. I mean, for years, when people would bring me in to talk to their boards or talk to their room full of funders, I would intentionally spend a good amount of time trying to help people understand the stakes in a moment, and not just people who are closest to the challenges. I'm seeing people with an enormous amount of privilege very far away from the day-to-day challenges of this time, who still understand what's happening. They see it's sort of it's undeniable. It's like not theoretical anymore, right? Um, what people are less clear about is what the role that philanthropy can play.
Hmm.
And um, in that way, I feel, just so grateful that the book gives me an opportunity to help people make sense of that right now. Um, and to really kind of invite people into a different philanthropic identity. It's like
Mm.
Andrew's Philanthropy said, oh, by virtue of being a philanthropist, like you're better than everybody, And in this new era, it's that it's not at all about our kind of the gap between us, but it's actually about our interdependence.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that um, if you are so lucky as to be in a position where you can move resources, it's an opportunity for solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
It's an opportunity to move those resources in ways that don't just benefit you or that don't just, cover up some bad deed that you and your company are doing, but that actually change our society and that change how power is held, how wealth is held. Um, and I don't know, I think that we're in such a moment of inequality that at least like when I talk to people, like all kinds of people, I think there is just a real hunger for a future that is much more just than this. I think we all want that for our kids, and so I do think like I look at this $1.9 trillion in endowments and money, by the way, that's going to grow, right? I think one of my motivations in writing the book is this great wealth transfer that is starting and that, is going to bring in, I think it's an additional $12 trillion into the sector. So I see these resources as just being the capital that we can use to build a future that's so different than the one that, the present that we're living in. And we're going to need that, right? These like the dreams that people have of just and equitable societies, like it will take resources. So I what makes me feel optimistic is that we actually have the resources.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if we're willing to let go of these really outdated old ways of doing things that I call much of philanthropy and the way we do it, these are artifacts from a very different time. And if we're willing to let go of those and step into what's needed now, I think that we really can meet the moment.
Mm.
Well, Dimple, thank you so much for what has been such a beautiful conversation in which I've learned so much personally. I know there's so much that our listeners will take away in terms of community that there is out there and folks who are wanting to build toward this new era of philanthropy, as you've outlined. I hope we can meet this moment. And without optimism, there's not as much that we can really accomplish here. And I thank you for all that you're doing. It's really a tremendous example of courageous leadership. We all play a role within philanthropy and working with philanthropists. I highly encourage our listeners here to pick up a copy of A New Era of Philanthropy, 10 Practices to Transform Wealth into a More Just Future. It's changed my thinking about philanthropy and what's possible, and even brought some new excitement to me about what it could look like to join others in pursuit of, a new vision for philanthropy with greater impact. So encourage everyone to pick this book up. It's available, just about anywhere that you look for books. And I certainly hope, Dimple, this isn't our last conversation of this sort. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much. This was great. I appreciate you.
All right.